This is Andy Garza. I'm going to interview Dr. Roy Blizzard. He is a Hebrew scholar and an archaeologist. He has his PhD in Hebrew from the University of Texas at Austin. And for the benefit of my psychology classes, one of the topics that we have to deal with is evolutionary psychology. And a lot of folks might have an opposition to, number one, evolution, and number two, the combining of evolution and psychology. But this brings into focus a pertinent topic about this that we would call a conflict between science and the Bible. And Roy, as an archaeologist, you have to be a scientist. And yet, if you're going to be a biblical archaeologist, then you're going to be dealing with the very two somewhat possible forces that seem to be at opposition. Being a man of science, and then a man dealing with a document that leads to folks having a sense of faith and a faith in God. And so from your experience over all these years as a man of science and a man of faith, is there a conflict between science and the Bible?
Well, let me begin by saying and emphasizing that I actually consider myself to be a man of science. And secondly, in answer to your question, there is no conflict between the best of what we know in all the scientific disciplines, and I emphasize all the scientific disciplines, and the biblical text, once you know what the biblical text says. Now, I started in science way before I started with the biblical text. As a matter of fact, when I was an undergraduate, I took an undergraduate major in logic and philosophy, which had a lot of psychology in it as well.
Critical thinking.
That's right, yeah. I always had that, and I always have, actually when I was an undergraduate, I thought that maybe one of these days I might wind up teaching science. And then as things happened, I wound up getting a PhD in Hebrew studies, the general field of Hebrew studies, and taught Hebrew at the University of Texas for quite a number of years, but at the same time had the opportunity to study archaeology in Israel with some of the most famous of the archaeologists in the country. Started in 1968. I hate to think that was that long ago, with Professor Mazar. You may have heard of Professor Mazar at the Temple Mount, and then several years later moved to another location with his nephew, Amichai Mazar, who is still today a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then with his granddaughter, Eilat Mazar, who is currently excavating at the temple area, made some of the most dramatic recent finds in Israel today. Her name is Eilat Mazar, and I excavated with her at Tel Achziv in Israel, in an ancient Phoenician site on the seacoast in Israel. But the thing that I was aware of all of the time that I was excavating with these individuals was that these people are not only scientists, individuals of science, but they're individuals of faith as well. And they have a deep seated connection with the biblical text. But quite unlike what the connection is between the average person in the pew and the biblical text, and the reason for that is their knowledge of Hebrew. Because this document that we call the Bible, is a Hebrew document from start to finish. Old Testament, New Testament is basically Hebrew. And in order to understand what it says, you have to know the language in which it was written.
And this is also a problem with the science side.
That with scientists who know nothing about the biblical text.
So neither side really
That's
can
right.
work with
It's,
the text.
it's hard for scientists who know nothing about the biblical text and theologians who know nothing about science for them to be able to sit down and have an intelligent conversation between the two. It's almost impossible if you do not know the Hebrew text. Because, and I want to emphasize this, that the Hebrew text does not say what you think it says in English. You can start out with the first verse in the biblical text. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it does not say that.
And the earth was without
Form
and void.
That it just does not say that in the Hebrew. And what does it say? Well, I've got it here before me. It says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. And it doesn't say in the beginning. I mean, the first word is mistranslated. And here you can see over here in this document that I have before me, the Jewish commentary on the subject, says that should be translated at first. At first, whenever that was, we don't know when that was.
Now this book that you're taking the commentary from, this is Onkelos.
This
from
book
about 1600 years ago.
Is Onkelos on the Torah. And although we do not know exactly when Onkelos translated the Hebrew text into Aramaic, we believe that it was probably sometime around 400 of the present era. And this particular text is still used in Judaism today. It's the main text that is used in Jewish studies, Onkelos, and until this very day.
It's considered very authoritative.
Yeah, very. But this document that I have before me is the first volume in a series of 5 on the Torah, and this is a Genesis volume with the commentary that was written by 2 very well-known rabbis, Israel Drazen and Stanley Wagner. So this gives you a perspective as to what the Jews continue to think about this material. And I want to read just one little brief passage here to kind of set the stage for what we're going to discuss. In this paragraph at the end of chapter 1, they ask the question, would we be considered irreverent if we suggested that the entire biblical story of the creation of humankind and their sin in the Garden of Eden is an allegory? Notice they say allegory and not a myth. That it's an allegory. That is a story that reveals a truth which is embedded in the text, which need not be taken literally. Could Adam and Eve be humankind? The Garden of Eden, the world, as it could be if we only hearken to God's commandments. The snake, the variety of temptations in life which draw us away from serving God. The sin of Adam and Eve, the choices that we have the power to make, the punishment and inevitable consequence of sin. And I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to say yes. That's exactly what we need to understand.
So this would have been the Hebrew way of telling a moral story that probably started off way before orally and passed down with a specific purpose, and the purpose wasn't to be scientific, but it had some moral implications.
It has a story to tell. And I will just tell you now that this whole idea of Adam and Eve is a misconception. That the word in Hebrew means humankind. We need to think of it as humankind. As God created Adam B'Tselmo in his image, male and female, Zachar und Keva, Barautam, and he created them. And he called their name Adam. Notice
Both of them.
it's plural, that he called their name, both of them, Adam. It just means humankind. He created humankind. The Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, just means a place of luxury, where everything that was needed was provided. And we could go on and follow the whole story with an explanation that makes sense. And it's not intended to be a scientific account, but it's intended to basically tell a story that has a moral to that story. But as you read through chapter 1 and on into chapter 2 in the biblical text, as a man of science, I can tell you that there is no conflict between the biblical text and the best that we know in all the scientific disciplines. And it just so happens that I know quite well the different scientific disciplines. I've not only been involved in archaeology, but in anthropology, paleontology. Those are all subjects that come to the fore in archaeology as well. Yes, we've got people that come in, and there's absolutely no conflict. I could lay the different geological ages and what happened in those different geological periods of time right alongside of the biblical text, and you'd see that there's basically no conflict. You can start with the cosmic era and go on to the Azoic and the Proterozoic and the Archeozoic and on, and exactly what it says happened or occurred during those different geological eras is essentially what is happening here in the biblical text. The problem is that when you look in the biblical text, you think that it says one thing, and it actually doesn't. It says something else. For example, it doesn't say that on such and such a day, God created such and such. For example, the birds. In Hebrew, it says, V'of ye'ofef birkiya hashamayim. And it's translated, God created birds. And it doesn't say that at all. Off is just anything that's got wings, and it's translated elsewhere in the biblical text for insects, grasshoppers. Same thing with a fish. Just let the water swarm with swarms of living things, and so on. And whenever you understand the Hebrew, it all of a sudden puts this thing into a whole different perspective. And it's one that men of science, who are of a scientific bent, who have problems with accepting the whole concept of God, have no problem understanding. They have no problem in relating to this material when it's presented to them in a scientific way.
Terminology.
Yeah.
So somebody that's scientifically oriented, critical thinking, things like that, if they understand then that the biblical text is not a text that you would consider to be incorrect scientifically. It's not trying to be scientific, and it's got a tale to tell, but yet, oddly enough, the language is ambiguous and abstract enough that it will fully elaborate or coincide with what science says, and suddenly that document isn't something to just be tossed aside as something that's invaluable, because we have, well, if you go back to Darwin, Origin of Species, and men of faith and science were more common then, I guess you'd say, but after that, when the Origin of Species seemed to contradict the Bible, but it was contradicting the translations and the understandings. It never really contradicted the Bible. Now, perhaps today, those that could take a second look would see that even evolution, change, differential reproduction, and mutations, and then population change over time doesn't have any conflict even with that. Well, that also brings to mind the words create in Hebrew. There's bara and asa.
And yitzer.
So there's different words for create, and you can be talking about creation, meaning something that came from something before.
Bara is only used of God. Only God baras something, and it means to create ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Asa means to create out of pre-existing material, and yitzer is to mold or fashion, like a potter molding a vessel. All of these are used, and are used in different ways, and you need to know in each passage that you read exactly what word is used in order to understand the text. But the point is, as you mentioned, that there's absolutely no conflict between the biblical text and science, regardless of whatever that scientific discipline might be.
Roy, thanks for your time and your insights into this, what I consider to be a very important topic. And I hope that I will be using these in my classes, and I hope that folks will maybe come away with a different understanding, and maybe free them up to be more open-minded. And to the bottom line is to learn.
Well, let's hope that they do.
Okay.
Maybe one of these days you'll invite me to come down, and I'll give the whole
I'll do it.
ball of wax.
I'll do it. Sounds good. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.